Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, welcome back to the show and our continuation of our treatment of the northern courts. We've worked through the Este of Ferrara and the Gonzaga and Mantua, and we're now turning our eyes to Milan and the Sforza court. I do not think there is any better way to do this than through the perspective of none other than Leonardo da Vinci, who worked extensively in the court of Ludovico Sforza during what is referred to as Leonardo's First Milanese Period, a very large chunk of his career which lasted from 1482 to 1499. That's nearly 18 years of Leonardo's career was in his first Milanese period under Ludovico Sforza. The Sforza court in 1482 was at the back end of some rather radical political turmoil. So let's set this up. When we talked about the conditions of the early Renaissance, you remember we did about 8 to 10 episodes on that. I want to remind you that Milan was already a duchy under the Visconti family, who had ambitions to conquer all of northern Italy under their rule. The Visconti were defeated and their direct line of dukes dissolved, yielding to the son-in-law, the spouse of Bianca Maria Visconti, and that is Duke Francesco I Sforza, who was able to rise through this marital alliance with the Visconti. So we see this transition from Visconti to Sforza, but it's the same sort of thread. When Francesco I died in 1466, the next Sforza Duke rose to power. One of my favorite names in Renaissance history, Galeazzo Maria Sforza. Galeazzo. I like that. If I have a son, I'll name him Galeazzo. He won't get bullied or anything. It was on the feast of Santo Stefano in 1476. We're about to get dramatic here, guys. And Galeazzo Maria was on his way to Mass in Milan's beautiful church of Santo Stefano when a group of conspirators attacked and they stabbed the Duke to death inside of the church. I went to Milan, I visited the site of this assassination, and there is actually now a commemorative plaque there for the assassinated Duke, who was only age 32, and it's sort of, I think the plaque is in the spot where it happened, which is right through the main entrance of the church. And this should ring a bell. 1476, Galeazzo Maria is assassinated by conspirators in a church on his way to Mass during a holy festival, because within a couple of years, another group of conspirators in Florence would use that same tactic to try to end the Medici line, the famous Pazzi conspiracy of 1478. All of this is related. And again, these conspirators failed as Sforza power continues in Milan. And so the duchy passed to the heir, who was actually still a very young child, I don't know, 8 and 9 years old, something like that, Gian Galeazzo Sforza. That is the young son of Galeazzo Maria Sforza, who became Duke in 1476. Okay, we're within 5 years of Leonardo arriving in the court now. Ludovico Sforza, our main Sforza of the day, who is also known as Ludovico il Moro, Moro meaning the Moor, meaning someone of North African origin. For his dark complexion, I don't think he was North African. They just called him that. He had dark hair, dark eyes, darker skin. And Ludovico il Moro began his regency over his nephew in 1480. The same year, Ludovico was betrothed to the young Beatrice d'Este, which forged an alliance between Ercole d'Este in Ferrara. So Milan-Ferrara is shoring up through marriage. Ludovico, yes, Gian Galeazzo is the duke, but we should think of Ludovico as a de facto ruler. He was running the court for this child duke, okay? That's what's going on here. So this is the political situation that Leonardo arrived in Milan in 1482. Duke Gian Galeazzo, Regent Ludovico il Moro, And what Leonardo was doing was looking to curry the favor of Ludovico Sforza as the regent of Milan. In that year, Leonardo was 30 years old, right? Up to this point, remember that Leonardo was born in the town of Vinci. So let's back up, right? So Leonardo was born in Vinci, which is the countryside outside of Florence, where he spent most of his adolescent years. He moved to Florence with his father. His father secured him an apprenticeship in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. An earlier podcast goes over all of this in details. It is in this period that Leonardo's earliest works appear in Florence in the workshop of Verrocchio, such as the angel that he paints in Verrocchio's Baptism of Christ, Leonardo's completed Annunciation, and does his revolutionary portrait of Ginevra de' Benci, which is now in Washington, D.C. And keep that in mind because we're going to talk about that again because we're looking at his innovations of portraiture in the Milan Sforza court today. So this transition from Florence to Milan at about 30 years old, it actually marks the creation of one of the most well-known but important documents to Leonardo's career, his letter and petition to Ludovico Sforza to offer his services to the Sforza court. In this letter, Leonardo lists off all of his abilities as an engineer, as an architect, a designer of weapons, defensive structures, all of this, all of the things that a ruler in a militarily tense environment would need, then sort of offhanded at the very end mentions that he can paint and sculpt as well. What does this tell us? It's hard to say that Leonardo was maybe a clever salesman of his talents in that he wanted to prioritize the things that a de facto duke would need, or that he actually valued his skills as an artist less than his skills as an engineer. You guys decide. So no matter how much he stressed his skills as an engineer, he ultimately was brought into the Sforza court to work predominantly on artistic commissions, either for religious entities, ephemeral works for processions, or things that are not meant to last forever that no longer exist, or frescoes, right? There's maybe at least one fresco that you know in Milan. We'll bring that back into the story here. Leonardo was given space alongside long-established Milanese court artists and brothers Evangelista and Ambrogio de' Predis. So at first he shares this space with them. His very first Milan work in this environment of this sort of established Milan school with these established Milan court painters was the famous Virgin of the Rocks, right? The first one in the Louvre, the second one is in London. And the Virgin of the Rocks was not for the court, but for the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception, which he loosely completed the first one around 1485, but it wasn't seen all the way through to completion. It wasn't delivered. Long story. And then another one was done in 1490. So there's two versions of this painting. They're absolutely magnificent works. They're stunning examples of Leonardo's complex compositions, fantasy-like imagination. They're fantastical, but they're religious.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show.
Mastery of light and shadow. They're highly complicated and they deserve a longer discussion in their own right. That's not exactly what we're doing here today. Also, during the First Milanese period, Leonardo was tasked to complete the largest known equestrian monument in the world. It's called sometimes Leonardo's horse, but it was never completed because that amount of bronze, it was becoming politically difficult to secure. There's a lot of records about trying to acquire the materials, blah blah blah. There's drawings of it, and we should understand it as Ludovico wanting to secure his legacy along the exact same lines as the Este did with their equestrian monument to Niccolo III, which we talked about, and Donatello's Gattamelata statue in Padua, one of those really early important equestrian monuments. And like this unfinished work, Leonardo's horse, Leonardo also did his enormously famous Last Supper in Milan in the later part of the 1490s, towards the end of his time there, which was also experimental, that the quality was compromised and it soon began to deteriorate. So while this painting is central to this period, please realize I've already done a whole podcast on it. No Last Supper today. Okay. But what I'm getting at is between his incomplete equestrian work, his experiment with the Last Supper, his incomplete first version of the rocks, he wasn't really completing a lot. This is something very commonplace with Leonardo, to not finish works, to aggravate his patrons, to be seen as a man who probably had ADHD or something. He just couldn't finish things. And for the horse, it's not necessarily his fault, but you guys get the picture. But there were some works finished. And Leonardo did a number of his most celebrated portraits during this time in the Sforza court, starting with an unfinished work known as a portrait of a musician. It is not this portrait, but another that I want to spend a fair amount of time with. The portrait of the musician I went and saw this year in the Ambrosiana, and it is pretty much incomplete or finished by a much lesser skilled hand. You can sort of work out where a master was doing painting, the face mostly, and this sort of paint that's everywhere else. I don't think it's a very impressive work, and I know that attribution is sort of loose on that one. But I want to talk about an absolute certain Leonardo, his so-called Lady with an Ermine, also known as the portrait of Cecilia Gallerani. Cecilia Gallerani was an oil on wood panel painting, walnut wood, completed around 1490. Guys, this portrait is undoubtedly, in my opinion, one of Leonardo's greatest works, if not his greatest work. It is in Krakow, Poland, and I'm lucky to have seen it in person there on Easter weekend 2018, very early in my art history career. We are about to discuss a work that revolutionized Renaissance portraiture and a substantial precursor to the Mona Lisa. The story of the subject, let's talk about the subject before we get to the technique, is very intriguing. Although I said Ludovico Sforza married Beatrice d'Este, she was only 5 years old at the time of their betrothal, and the marriage itself would have to wait. You don't marry 5-year-olds in the Renaissance typically. You wait until they're at least 13 or something like this. In the meantime, Ludovico fell completely enamored with the 15-year-old Cecilia Gallerani, the subject of the portrait, who was the daughter of, let's call them mid-level members of the court. No one too important, but they had a daughter that caught Ludovico's eye, and soon Cecilia was seen everywhere with Ludovico, even moving into the rooms of the Castello Sforzesco. If you've been to Milan, that is that enormous castle palace slapped right in the middle of the city. As far as can be told from the sources, Ludovico was not merely attracted to her body, but to her intelligent mind and her very charming personality. She was a hit, right? Cecilia was not only the object of the court poets and artists, she's getting painted, she's sung about in many sonnets by the court poets, but she was schooled in Latin and composed her own poetry, both in Latin and in vernacular Italian. She also became pregnant in 1490 when she was roughly 18, I think. Renaissance people, this is more or less the norm. So Ludovico had an official court mistress who was highly intellectual and was now pregnant with their child. Well, yes, remember, he was betrothed. And this, of course, would cause some questions about the betrothal in Ferrara, but Ludovico eventually will have the wedding. And when he married Beatrice d'Este, he ensured Cecilia Gallerani was married to a wealthy count in a respected family. Most importantly, the portrait of Cecilia Gallerani by Leonardo was the first known painting commission given to Leonardo by Ludovico Sforza. And he had already been in Milan for nearly a decade by the time he's commissioned to do a portrait. Okay, so have a look at this portrait. It's called The Lady with an Ermine. Ermine, I always said Ermine, and then someone corrected me. It's Ermine. It's this ferret-like creature. And I'll explain why it's so radical and revolutionary. If you can look at this while I speak or have a quick moment to look at it and burn it into your memory, let's consider the purpose of a portrait in Renaissance Italy. They were to capture the likenesses of the upper class and to furnish these likenesses with signals of virtue or hereditary values, right? Coats of arms and family sayings and this sort of thing. The earliest Renaissance portraits were done in profile, like known images of Roman emperors on coins and cameo carvings. Soon, with the rise of humanism, the surge of Platonic philosophy, concepts about the glance, the gaze, one's eyes became extremely important. Leonardo wrote about this, hearkening to the concept of, we know this expression, the eye as the window to the soul. You can get access to someone's internal, intellectual, and spiritual value through their eyes. This is what Leonardo is sticking to. This is the radical part. This type of access in portraits was first only afforded to men. Men were the first to get broken out of this profile view so you can get access to their glance, to their eyes. It takes decades and Leonardo da Vinci to extend this type of intellectual appreciation to his female sitters. He experiments this with the Florentine Ginevra de' Benci, who gives you a direct glare into her eyes, right? He does the Ginevra de' Benci portrait in the 1470s. So when Leonardo opens up the glance of the female sitter, he gives you access to her soul, her psyche, her intellect, and the value of her in humanistic terms. I want to say Leonardo himself was not a Neoplatonist, but this is an aspect of Platonic philosophy that he did enjoy. We have to keep in mind, like Ginevra's portrait and Cecilia's, were paid for and commissioned by their male benefactors, not entirely removing them from this Renaissance patriarchal order. Yet, portraits in this period of women were very often for commemorating marriage or betrothal. In this case, it appears possible that Cecilia is being painted as a member of the court, Ludovico's mistress, but not in any lewd or slanderous way. So in this portrait, we do not see her direct glance, but an even more radical innovation to the gaze, right? She is responding to something outside of the canvas. Her body twists in the other way, in the opposite way than she's looking. And just like that, you have a novel composition in Renaissance portraiture. This sort of torso turned one way, the head turned the other. And that also means that we are losing the mere representative aspect of her. And the furry little cutie pie that she's holding, that's the ermine, this weasel-like creature. It's also reacting to whatever it is that has disturbed Cecilia. And it looks a little hostile, I think. a little defensive as her very delicate, look at this, guys, look at this, her very delicate, masterfully crafted fingers, look at her fingers, delicately press into the sort of neck area of the ermine, warning it feels to me, this is my analysis, not to spring off, that everything's going to be okay, right? Because she's smiling, isn't she? Look at her face. You know, the reason I do this, if any of you guys have a pet, my dog was like this, right? Everything on planet Earth was a threat to me, according to him, and my dog. And ermines and weasels are protectors. So how often did I have to grip my dog gently like that? Those fingers, look at the way they're pressing into the ermine's neck, but in a way saying gently, like, stand down, it's all right, little buddy, right? Someone walks, like you got your creature on your lap, and someone walks into the room and immediately goes into defense mode, and you put a light hand on it and a little slight amount of pressure saying, don't worry. That seems to me to be exactly what's happening here. And the presence of the ermine is also both symbolic and it's a bit of a pun. And Leonardo definitely did puns with his portraits. If we look at Ginevra da Vinci, that first portrait he did in Florence, he placed her in front of a juniper bush, a ginepro in Italian, which evokes Ginevra, Ginepro, Ginevra. So he was doing this to be clever. Similarly, the name Gallerani, remember the sitter is Cecilia Gallerani, the name evokes the Greek galle, which means ermine. So Leonardo's very clever, right? The ermine is also contradictorily evoking both purity, which in a way legitimizes her relationship with Ludovico, but they are also associated with pregnancy and the protection of pregnant women. Their son, Cesare Sforza, was born in 1491, which tells us that she was very likely already pregnant when this portrait was completed. And lastly, the ermine was a symbol of Ludovico himself, who was a member of the Order of the Ermine. Okay, with all this in mind, what appears to be, when you look at all of the portraits of the Renaissance, a fairly odd pictorial invention becomes obvious choice of iconography, the inclusion of this ermine in this painting. So, in this moment, perhaps Ludovico has entered her chambers. And this is that precise moment when he walks in. Or maybe she's listening to something, or she's just heard something. There's an array of sensorial complexity in her expression. And it not only makes you feel like the one who has disturbed her, but that to the modern viewer at the time, this portrait almost is an entirely new genre. Technique-wise, Leonardo has placed a vibrant light source coming from whatever Cecilia is looking at, creating a continuity with what is off the canvas. He also expertly uses his trademark sfumato technique. Remember, this is not linear art that we see in the Florentine workshops, nor is it the Milanese court style. It is Leonardo, and that means using the oil paint to create soft shadow, blurred line, form, modeling, and definition, critically studied. Now, this becomes a Lombard Milanese style because everyone follows Leonardo. But at this time, he's still doing the groundwork. And to turn the page, another portrait, either mostly or entirely done by Leonardo's hand, arises not long after the maximum it was done by 1497, and it's known as the Belle Ferronniere, which was also an oil on walnut wood panel, proven to be the same or similar walnut panel as the Cecilia Gallerani portrait, which is how it's sort of attributed to the same. It's one of the pieces of evidence is okay. This is Leonardo. The name of the portrait, La Belle Ferronniere, derives from the small decorative jewel that the sitter is wearing. The identity of this woman is less certain, but it has been proposed as a second portrait of Cecilia Gallerani, which I'm not convinced of the likeness. If you look at the two of them, I don't think it's the same person. Or it could be of the court mistress who replaced Cecilia, Lucrezia Crivelli, and that to me seems to be the more accurate story here for this portrait, which is equally gorgeous. But as you look at these two works, please do not be confused by an odd detail in the Ermine portrait, where at the top left, it is literally written on the work, La Belle Ferronniere, Leonardo da Vinci, and da Vinci is spelled with a W. And that's because this title was added during a Polish restoration in the 1700s, which also likely included the deep blackening of the background. However, the figure remains to be fully and wholly the work of Leonardo da Vinci, right? So there's an existing mistitle still painted directly onto the lady with an ermine painting, and we indeed have two separate mistress portraits by Leonardo from his time in Ludovico il Moro Sforza's court. And it is also during this period, July of 1490 to be precise, that Leonardo is introduced to one of the most consequential figures of his personal life, Gian Giacomo Caprotti, better known as Salai. That is the name given to this devil plucked from the Florentine Luigi Pulci's work Morgante, little devil, Salaino or Salai, right? Salai was only 10 years old in July of 1490 when he moved in with Leonardo. He was from the peasant class and had a terrible habit of stealing things. Leonardo seemed both charmed and frustrated with Salai. I'll tell you of one notable occurrence related to the Duke, so we keep this coherent. So remember, Ludovico was betrothed to Beatrice d'Este in 1480, but had Cecilia Gallerani as his public court mistress. The actual wedding occurred between Beatrice and Ludovico in 1491, right after Salai joined Leonardo. Leonardo was doing work for the marriage, working on the tournament and the festivities for the marriage with his little devil with him, while in the house of a respected Sforza courtier, Galeazzo Sanseverino. Salai stole the money right from this guy's house. Right? Just took it. 11-year-old peasant class boy joining the home of a major court painter of one of the most powerful duchies in Italy is just nabbing people's money. You guys, this is one of many recorded instances of Salai's petty theft. Still only 10 or 11 at this point. Importantly, guys, Leonardo and Salai mirror the story of the Duke somewhat, as it seems that Leonardo was really enamored with this young boy who would stay with Leonardo from this point almost the rest of his life. It's probably, but not certain, that they had either a sexual or a romantic relationship, which would not have occurred when Salai was 10, but maybe around 15 or 16, which still, for the modern person, is very uncomfortable. This relationship is mentioned in sources in the 16th century, so it's sort of immediately picked up on. Leonardo never married, and even before he went to Milan, he already had a sodomy accusation against him in Florence, and even more so, there are plenty of erotic references to Salai in his notebooks, both by Leonardo and his workshop, who also contributed to some of his notebooks. Salai modeled certainly for many drawings, including erotic and sensual ones, and even is the sitter for a few of Leonardo's known paintings. And it has been claimed, and I am not stating my opinion on this one yet, that Salai was also the sitter for the Mona Lisa. Have a look at the faces and you tell me what you think. I love the idea, though, of this mad genius Leonardo taking on some rascal thief peasant as a pupil and the antics of their life were certainly dramatic. So Salai is said to be more of an assistant than a pupil, though, or apprentice, but he did produce a small number of paintings in the Leonardesque style. I often see his work discounted as lacking skill or sophistication, but I do not agree with this assessment. While very few known works are certainly attributed to him, the head of Christ Redeemer and the Ambrosiana, look that one up, or I'll put it in the show notes, bears his signature, which he signs Salai, having fully adopted the nickname given by Leonardo as his artist name, which I think is pretty fascinating. I don't think an unskilled assistant can paint like that. That is my point. It might not be the highest quality, the absolute highest quality of painting, but this is not something that you just kind of pick up in passing, is what I mean. To conclude, Renaissance people, by 1499, Leonardo was set to leave his station in Milan. Let's put all of this together. When Lorenzo de' Medici died in 1492, that weakened and damaged Florence and her alliances. Young Gian Galeazzo, the nephew of Ludovico, died in 1494, making Ludovico the Duke of Milan. So during this 18-year period, Ludovico was only Duke for 5 years, even though he was already acting as Duke. The French invasion of Italy was well underway at this point. The Italian Wars, they're called. Leonardo was working both on the Last Supper and the highly damaged fresco in what's called the Sala delle Aze in the Sforza castle, which is in horrible condition today, having various disputes about money and the completion of the projects with the Duke. So by 1499, the French army had breached Lombardy and Duke Ludovico was forced to flee Milan. Leonardo survives both the invasion of Milan by the French and the occupation by King Louis XII, even becoming allied with the French forces. Due to his personality and work struggles with Ludovico, the threat of Ludovico's return prompted Leonardo to pack his bags and prepare to go back to Florence after 18 years in the Sforza court, and he took Salai with him. We know Leonardo, of course, will eventually be employed by the French, returning to Milan for what is known as his Second Milanese Period, which occurs between 1506 and 1513, and eventually, after a bit more history, transitions to and died in France. They say culturally that it was not France who conquered Italy, but Italy that conquered France, as the French Renaissance begins at this moment. Renaissance people, I hope you enjoyed this conversation and some very fascinating history about the Sforza court, and especially of Cecilia Gallerani, Leonardo da Vinci, and Salai. We have a little more gas in the tank until 2026, so stay tuned, and until next time, arrivederci.